All right, we'll get started here today with Lecture 11. Apologize for once again having some AV difficulties here. I'll just check in here on my, I think it's Firefox on my top hat. Still churning away there, great. Lecture 11. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about this competitive markets structure. And once again, what we're doing here is, well, a couple of things. One of which is fleshing out kind of a benchmark understanding as to how a firm operates in a market with the idea that we can build upon and extend this down the road. The other thing you get to see as we do this is you get a feel for how we can make our assumptions about how the world works, how we can kind of impose them or build them into our graphs. So hopefully you're getting a feel for that as well. And we'll do more of this as we go along today. Hopefully by the end of the class, we'll get to extend things in maybe a direction that you'll find I don't want to say more interesting, but you'll find interesting. So just some bookkeeping. I was trying to log in the Top Hat. It doesn't seem to be working here. But that what we decided was an extra credit assignment, right? It's about regulation and why we have it, right? It's on Top Hat now, and it's due tomorrow. The reason why it's due tomorrow is I think I'm going to ask Daniela to, make kind of a compilation of what everybody says in the class, and then maybe we'll come back and talk about it on Tuesday. I think that might be kind of fun to see what you guys had to say about this collectively. So I'm going to postpone putting up another homework, but I will do that soon. We are, of course, barreling towards spring break, and I think we have readings through chapter 10 that are up and going. So maybe by the time spring break rolls around, we'll sort of collect all of our assignments and see where we stand here. Where do we? Okay, come on, man. So that's still not working. I might have to think of a quick alternative way to take attendance, because a lot of you seem to be disappointed that I didn't. I guess you would be if you were here, right? Why not be recorded? Anyways, okay. So we'll keep checking in and see how that goes. Competitive markets and firms. So we're describing the situation, right? What a competitive market is. And you might sort of, to put the objective of all of this first, why are we doing this? Well, for one reason is to think about how the world works when the decisions facing firms, right, individual businesses, are as simple as possible, right? And it turns out in this particular context, if you think about the real world, it's complicated. And you think about all these businesses sort of thinking about their competition and their competitors and how they all interact. Those are tough problems that we'll get to. This is a simple problem. We've set it up so a firm really just has one thing to decide. Well, really two things. It just has a production decision. How much do I make given a market price, right? And then we can sort of build an entire understanding as to how this industry works around this relatively simple decision. So really, the simple decision has two aspects to it, and we've built our model in such a way so that we can think about these in terms of average and marginal cost, right? How much do I produce on a day-to-day basis? And then, should I be in this business at all? Those are the big two decisions that the firm faces here. So we made a whole bunch of assumptions to get this as simple as possible. We assumed that our firms are small relative to the market, that they produce roughly the same thing, right? So we're talking about maybe something like wheat, or if you want oil, you think about individual, wildcat oil producers. And we also think that maybe this job that they're doing is, it's not like a high-tech thing. Firms can enter into this market and leave this market without too much difficulty. And so oftentimes you think about all of this boiling down to the idea that firms are price takers. They see a price and they react to it, right? This will be in sharp contrast to some of the stuff we talk about in next week, or maybe even later today. Anyway, so when I'm talking about this thing called the business enterprise, what do I have in mind? Well, really what pops into my mind is cost curves, average cost and marginal cost in particular, right? What are these things? Well, average costs tell me, take the total costs of producing and divide it by the number of units, costs per unit, right? Average costs. I care about that because I can just compare it to price, right? And that tells me if I'm winning or losing, right? If I'm making money or losing money. Is price greater than average cost? Then I have a profit margin. Marginal costs tell me how my costs change, how up and down, right, as I produce additional units, right? So how much is it going to cost me if I'm producing, 1,000 bushels of wheat or 50 cups of coffee? How much is it going to cost me to produce another one, right? And so that tells me something about how close I am to getting, I guess you could say, getting past my capacity. And ultimately, both of these things, maybe I didn't say it clearly last time, but these are really determined by, you think about the technology of production, how I actually go about producing, right? How much workers do I need to do something? How much electricity and power and other raw materials do I need to do something? That's all about what the situation is, what the technology is I use to produce. Okay, so my simple oil rig example, if you remember it from last time, kind of looked like this. We had different amounts of output. There were total costs. The important thing about this is really that when I produce, or I'll just sort of, two things I'll point out about this. When I'm producing nothing, there are still costs, right? Those are my fixed costs. The costs of just buying a building, putting it in place, putting a pipeline in place, those are my fixed costs maybe in my oil rig example. So there are fixed costs. The other thing you'll notice is that marginal costs are increasing, right? That's something different than just saying costs go up as I produce more. It says as I make an additional unit, the additional costs are going up, right? So doing more and more gets progressively harder and harder. I harp on that a little bit because students often get a little, they find it a little confusing to distinguish between increasing changes and just increasing, right? This is increasing changes. Okay, so when I said in my mind, when I think about what when an economist says firm, cost curves kind of pop into their minds. This is kind of what I had in mind. We have the AC and MC curves look like this. AC is U-shaped, and MC cuts AC at the minimum point, right? Those were kind of the two big facts here. And that's what I mean here when I say geometry of AC and MC. One is U-shaped. Why is that the case? Well, first, those fixed costs that you spend, you're spreading those over more units. So average costs come down. But ultimately, the difficulty of successively increasing production, right, increasing marginal costs, pulls it up. And you put all that together, and then we had the Carl Anthony Towns Danny DeVito effect. That's not what it's called in the textbook, strangely enough. But the idea that marginals pull averages down when they're lower than the average, and marginals push averages up when they're above the average, leads to this geometric relationship between these two. Okay. So I think I said, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask about the graph.
Yeah.
Why are marginal costs fixed at a constant rate?
Oh, okay. So that's a good question. And I could say there's sort of two ways to answer this. There's no reason why they should go up at these fixed increments, is kind of what you were asking, right? That's purely expositional and for simplicity, right? I did that so the graph looks nice. But typically, if you look in a book, or if you take, Eco 200 or 300, it'll just be in any increasing curve, right? It could be increasing at an increasing rate, or so it's good you ask that. The important thing about marginal costs is that they're increasing, right? Not that they have a particular shape. Good question. Yeah, and that's kind of true of everything, right? Like there's no reason why demand has to be a straight line. Demand, for example, just should be downward sloping, right? Supply doesn't have to be a straight line either, but it should also be upward sloping. And one thing that you do is you dig deeper into the world of economics is you sort of think about those things in greater detail, right? More generality and greater detail. So I think I said all this stuff when I was discussing geometry on this slide, but there it is for your studying ideas. And then we saw that we could parlay all of this into a theory of decision making. If you remember my grilled cheese operation, which said firms should produce when price is equal to marginal cost, right? That maximizes the firm's profits. And you can almost, hopefully you can think about, what we did last time, but that was kind of the idea where you'd say, all right, well, let's see, should I produce another cup of coffee or another unit of wheat? Well, what calculation do I make in my mind when I do this? I sell a cup of coffee for $4, $3, let's say, right? And it's going to cost me $2.50 to produce. Well, if that's the case, I should make it, right? Because I'm going to generate 50 cents in additional profits. Let's suppose I could make another cup of coffee and it costs me $2.99 to make. And $3 is the price. Well, I should still do it. My profits are still going up, right? But once I get to P equal MC, that's no longer true. And one way of thinking about this, I think it's helpful for what follows, is you can think about this as comparing additional costs and additional revenues, right? Marginal costs versus marginal revenue. In our setting, price and marginal revenue are the same, right? The additional money I get from selling something is just the price. Now, when we talk about pricing decisions and how, if you wanted to set the price of your product, how you should go about doing it, students typically enjoy that. Well, then the two things can be different, and we'll get into that. Then once the dust settles from me trying to get price equal as close as possible to marginal cost, I can then think about how I'm doing. I can then add up all the profits. I can say, okay, well, I'm now producing 100 units. The price is $3. The average cost is $2.50. So I'm making 50 cents per unit. That gives me $50 in profits. And I'm going to show you how all this works out in a second. And also, by way of so doing, I'm going to introduce this new idea, right? That you can see everything you need to see about a firm on a picture like this, right? If you toss a price line on here, you give a firm a price, now we can figure out everything we need to figure out about this firm, and the picture looks something like this. So we see here, I have it labeled little Q star here. Q star is where the firm maximizes its profits, right? That's because that's where price, right? That line there, price, the firm is just sort of thinking about that horizontal line as price. That's where price and marginal cost are equal, right? Okay, so that's where I maximize profits. Now, if I follow that dashed line going up to marginal costs, right? This is the quantity I produce. If I go up to average costs, that gives me average costs at this profit maximizing Q, right? So the difference up there between those two, price and average cost, that's my profit margin, right? My prices in my example that I gave you is $3 and my costs were $2.50. That little distance would be 0.5. Now maybe you're getting used to this idea of using geometry when we can. If we take the profit margin and multiply it by the number of units here, well, we get that yellow rectangle. That's my total profits, right? So it's a great diagram. Think about all the information we've packed onto this diagram, right? We can see what a firm should do when we give it a price, and we can see how well it's doing, right? In addition to all those neat little details we thought about when we put together this diagram, right? The law of increasing, or the principle of increasing costs, I'll call it. We had some fixed costs in there. It's a great diagram. And it's only going to get better. So, by the way, you can even, I thought about playing around. There's this guy who makes all these awesome videos online that are like animated math videos. I thought about trying to make one where you sort of have a slider here for Q. You can kind of slide it up and down. And then on the side, you kind of have the size of that rectangle. Suffice it to say, you can think about what's going on here is we're just moving this Q around to make that yellow rectangle as large as possible, right? And it just happens to be at this point, well, it doesn't just happen, but it happens to be at that point where MC and Q are equal. So you can see what happens if you move this Q back, you shorten the rectangle, right? But you make it thicker. If you move this way, you flatten the rectangle, but you make it longer, right? So you're kind of trading off those two things, and this kind of hits the sweet spot there, right? And makes the rectangle as big as it can be, right? It's kind of a neat thing. Maybe I'll see if I can figure that out one of these days. That sounds like a great way to waste an afternoon when I should be doing something else. Even better, though, we can now use this diagram to say all kinds of things about all kinds of industries, right? And ultimately, that's what we were after, is this way of thinking about economic organization and how it changes over time, how a market works over time, and we actually can kind of do all of that with this diagram, and I'm going to show you how it works. So the logic is as follows. We look at a diagram like this, and we figure out what firms do, what all the little firms in our industry are doing, right? We observe whether or not they're making profits, but then we can also think about what the overall industry looks like, right? When we have a bunch of little firms doing this. Well, what we then do is we then say there's people out there or other potential businesses out there that can observe this industry and decide whether or not to get involved or not, right? So you can think about it this way. I'm sort of looking around at, vape shops in New York City or nail salons, or I'm trying to think of something that there's a lot of, right? Even though they don't fit the model exactly. I say, wow, they look like they're doing pretty well. Maybe I'll just start one up, right? I'll enter the industry, right? Put another, in the lingo, we would say, well, in my lingo, we would say, I see a yellow rectangle there, I'm going to jump into the industry. Well, when a lot of people think this way, it expands the total industry supply. But suffice it to say, we think about entry occurring when there's profits being made, right? The yellow rectangle is there, right? Of course, we can also think about the opposite. Maybe we say, wow, there's nail salons everywhere now. They can't possibly be making any money. If I'm in that business, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave, right? There'll be exit. And what we'll say is that these things, when they happen systematically or in large numbers, have implications for industry supply. I'm going to show you how it works. Now, the nice thing about this is we can also think about time in this way, right? We can think about day-to-day operations, choosing your Q, right? Getting your Q star P equal MC. That's one thing. Well, over a longer period, you're going to do that day-to-day, week to week, whatever. But over a longer period of time, you can say, well, I'm going to get out of this business, say when my commercial lease expires. Or, next year I'm not planting any wheat. And that would be something you might or might not do based on whether or not you're making profits. So one of the great things about this, and I'm going to show you, is that this is a really neat, flexible definition of time. Economic time, where we break things into the short run and the long run. We can kind of move it around to all sorts of different industries. And indeed, when you think about economics, it's often that's kind of what you do, is you say, okay, well, let's think about what will happen in the short run, but then what happens in the long run when people can really change their plans. So I'll talk about all of these things as the class moves along here. But we can say a couple of things about the distinction between short run and long run, and why they occur. So logically speaking, time differences, why the long run might be really long. Well, it might be in some industries that are very capital intensive, right? You need to build a lot of machinery or put a lot of machinery in place. You need to train people, all of those things. Well, that would lead to a long run that lasts a long time. So if you look at the automobile industry, the automobiles, they can change how many cars they produce given their plants and suppliers and all that stuff. They can, workers, all that, they can bounce that around, in the matter of a couple months. But they can really only decide whether or not they're going to get out of the industry, right? Maybe if you even think about, are we going to produce trucks or cars? Those are the sort of long-run decisions that take years, right? So that would be kind of my framework there. Restaurants, you might be able to jump into restaurants or retail in a matter of days, right, or weeks. Well, the long run might, be something longer. You have to commercial lease. You have to. I'm sorry. What I meant to say is, in a restaurant, you can sort of call someone up every morning and ask if they can come into work, right? Or so you can vary things pretty quickly there. But the long run, you have to take care of, getting your kitchen together if you're thinking about a restaurant, signing a lease, all of that stuff. And of course, I did mention here one thing that determines a lot of this. Oh, right here is the regulatory environment, right? What sort of licenses do you need to have? Is there required training, inspections, things like that, right? I think you can, let me just fix this. The long run here is, and energy, of course, is another one. We'll talk about this a little bit later in class. It's kind of interesting. If you're running an oil rig, for example, you can in the short run, you can kind of dial up or dial down production in a month or two. In the long run, building a new rig and all that stuff takes a little bit longer. It's actually, energy has kind of changed in this way, at least oil production, in that it's pretty possible to it dials up almost instantly when the price goes above a certain amount, because people mothball things, right? You say, well, when the price gets above $60 a barrel, we'll start this well up, but otherwise we'll let it just sit there. Higher education's an interesting one because it works a little bit differently. I guess you could call it the regulatory environment. The short run is rather long, right? If we want to change up the courses and all that stuff and the majors that we're offering, that takes a while. And it takes a real long time to reform or to create a completely different educational system. Part of this has to do with tenure and stuff like that, right? The tenure system, the training that it takes to get a PhD and all that stuff. So that's kind of an interesting example here. Let me just pause briefly and see what's going on here. Nothing, it turns out. Maybe I'll try it again. Give us all a little break here. Try this. You get to watch me mess around with the computer again. All looks well when we start here. I get here, and the gears just turn. All right, I'll think in the background. I will think a little bit about how we're going to take attendance today, if this top hat thing doesn't get going. Okay, moving on. So how do we put all this together? Kind of like this, right? It's kind of a combination of everything we've been talking about this semester. On the left-hand side, we have our beloved demand and supply diagram, right? Demand and supply cross and create a market price, right? Well, this market price then goes across to the firm, right? The firm takes it as given. And the firm maximizes its profit, right, by setting MC, or picking out the Q, I should say, where MC is equal to price. And you can see I've even shaded in a little rectangle there that indicates that this firm is making profits, right? Indeed, you might call this whole picture short-run equilibrium in good times, right? So this firm is in an industry, in which it can make a comfortable profit. The decisions of firms, so what you'd have to do is this would have to make sense, in terms of aggregation. Each firm is doing this. The number of firms would have to produce Q. And then, of course, the demand and supply would have to interact to generate the P there. But you can kind of think about this as a relatively complete picture of how the industry works, right? Short-run equilibrium in good times. Kind of neat. And I think I have an example here. So I added in just some details. People like to have numbers. And so I have this is the maple syrup industry. So you think about the way I might sort of build the backstory is I might say, well, maple syrup is made primarily by, small farmers all throughout, Vermont and New Hampshire or whatever, New England, whatever. So there's a lot of them. Each little farm makes 30 bottles a week or a month or something, as I have it here. So you see I have Q equal 30. So each firm is small, and the weekly production across the market is 10,000. So we have each firm producing 30 bottles and 10,000 bottles changing hands. The price, this is consistent with the price of 8, right, in the market. And the typical firm, well, it costs $6.50 to produce a bottle, right, on average. The average costs are 6.5. So then you can sort of think about the profit margin here is 1.5, the distance between 8 and 6.5 there. And we multiply that by 30, and we see that each firm is making $45 a week, right? If that's I don't have the units as well labeled as I should, but that's kind of what's going on here. So you could even figure out the number of firms here. Yeah?
Sorry. Will average and marginal costs always be defined when you ask us to calculate it?
Yeah, I have to tell you, without marginal cost, you can't figure out what the firm should do to maximize profits. Without average costs, you can't tell how the firm is doing, right? So you kind of minimally need the two. I guess if I just said, what is it, actually we're going to get to this a little bit. If I get rid of average cost, I can at least describe for you what a firm is going to do, right? Even though I can't say much else about, how well it's doing from those decisions. Typically we try to keep both of those there all the time. Anyways, this is a short-run equilibrium in good times, right? Oh, but I was going to say, let's see, if I wanted to figure out how many firms are in the industry, I could just take this Q, right? It's 10,000. And I could divide it by 30. And that gives me 333 firms, I guess, producing maple syrup in this industry. Okay, so that's the short-run equilibrium in good times, as I say. So we would observe that in the way I've drawn the picture, firms are making a profit, right? And so what do we think about this? Well, we think about maple syrup. There's a lot of people who have backyards and rural areas. You might say that everybody's saying, well, Baker is killing it. He has a new boat. He's making all this money making maple syrup. What's stopping me from doing that, right? Let's see, I can go down to Home Depot, I can buy this, I can order that online. I think that in 3 months, I could have everything up and running in my garage, right? And jump into this industry as well. So over a long enough period of time, people see the profits and they decide to enter the industry, right? And so I've put that time frame at about a couple months. Interestingly, when we talk about macroeconomics, we'll have an idea of what the long run is as well. That kind of jibes with all of that. But anyway, then I can decide to get into the industry or not. But we do have to think a little bit more carefully about this, right? So maybe I'm thinking about, I have a job, I work at the local Home Depot, right? We'll say that, right? And I say, well, I could get involved in this maple syrup industry and make $45 in profit, and I guess I should do that. But when I'm thinking about profits, I have to be honest with myself here. An economist would always be honest about this. I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't say I'm going to just go work at home and then every day I do my maple syrup operation and then there's some money there. I have to think about paying myself too, right? When I think about costs, I have to say, well, let's see, I'm making $20 an hour at Home Depot. I have to be sure I can pay myself $20 an hour making maple syrup, right? And if there's profits over and above that, so much the better, right? If there aren't profits, well, then I'm making $20 at Home Depot. I'm making $20 doing maple syrup. So what's the difference? We need to fully account for our costs, And that, one way of thinking about this is we have to account for opportunity costs. My time isn't free, I'll put it that way. That goes into the costs. And I think that's important when we think about what happens over time. So I do say that you have to think about the time you're putting in as a cost as well, right? Something that needs to be compensated. I say it up there too. We have to think about opportunity costs as well, what else we could be doing with our time and resources. So what will happen over time to our industry? This is kind of how our dynamics work out in this industry. And we would say that as people all over New England realize that there's money to be made from by selling maple syrup to tourists from New York City, they jump into the game and start producing a little. And as this happens en masse, supply should shift out, right? Industry supply should gradually shift out. So I have my original supply curve there, dashed line. What happens over time is it kind of shifts out to this S prime line, and you can see that, this doesn't really have anything to do with the New Yorkers going to, New England for the weekend in the fall. So demand doesn't change, but supply does. It shifts out, and as a consequence, price falls, right? So price has gone from 8 to 6.5, and as a result, I'm looking over here and I'm saying, well, I used to sell maple syrup at $8 a bottle, right? Now the price is falling because of all these people all around me also selling maple syrup. As it falls, well, I decrease my production, right? The point at which marginal cost and price intersect is kind of sliding backwards for me. And what I've drawn it here is I've shown kind of the logical conclusion to this. In the end, nothing else will happen once we hit this point where price and marginal cost and average cost are all the same, right? What is going on here? Well, I'm maximizing profits, right? Because price is equal to marginal cost. But at the same time, I'm not making any profits, right? Average cost and price are the same. So what does that mean, right? And maybe now you can appreciate why I was careful to fully account for my costs. It means that, let's see, I bought all my stuff. I set up my maple syrup operation. I, do an honest accounting with myself. I pay for that stuff. I pay myself $20 an hour that I could be earning at Home Depot. And I find that I'm not really making any money over and above what it costs to produce the maple syrup and pay myself. Right? Put another way, I would be indifferent between maintaining my operation and just leaving and going back to Home Depot. In the end, I would have the same amount of money. And of course, in reality, you have to think about stuff like quality of life. Maybe I like being autonomous, all those things. You have to factor those in, but it really doesn't change the calculation that much. In fact, there's an enormous literature on this. It's a fascinating literature on like individual entrepreneurship and business startups and all of that. I've thought a bit about some of that stuff. But anyways, this is the long run equilibrium of the industry, right? That's what it looks like. The price of maple syrup is 6.5. The typical firm is producing about 24 bottles and is covering all of its costs, yes, but not getting anything else, right? The way we might even say that is no economic profits are being made here. Different than accounting profits, right? Okay, so you can work it that way, or you can work it in a different fashion. And it's sometimes, maybe I'll do this on the board, and we'll think about an example here. I say, what about an oversaturation market? Maybe we're talking about vape shops or nail salons or something. I'm going to draw that out. But I'm going to take one last kind of try at this Top Hat thing here. And let's see, is there another browser here?
The Firefox.
Oh, wait. What's this? It's not really a browser, but whatever. I'll try it again. Well, last time here.
It's still in Safari though, no?
Yeah, it's still, let me,
Try Firefox.
I'll try Firefox one last time. This is getting tedious. And then, in the meanwhile, maybe I'll, here we go again. Does anybody have a spare piece of paper? If you want to just, maybe we can just send one around and you can kind of write your names down and all that stuff. Oh, you can keep that. If you need I have a pen, I think, so just want to write your name and pass it along. We'll get the attendance sheet that way. Of course, as soon as I decide to do that, Top Hat's going to start working here. And if you don't get it during class, you can just kind of sign it at the end of class. All right. Okay, so let's think about a worked example here. I'll try to work it on the board while we're doing that. And, it's sometimes useful just to see this happen in live action. So the way we might think about an industry working here is we have here's our firm, here's our market, right? And the way we would do this is, okay, our market has a demand and a supply. Here's a big Q. I'll use big Q to denote market quantity, right? Here's the price. Our attendance sheet's making its way around there. We have plenty of time to do it, so. And then, of course, the individual firm here has the price kind of comes across like this, right? So this is price and marginal revenue for the firm. It's just price here in the market. And then we can add in the firm's marginal cost curves. I'll call this little q here. And we can add an average cost like this, right? And you can see here what I've drawn is a firm and market. This is little q star. And this is big Q star, right? So that's kind of my firm and my market. Hopefully you can see that. I tried to make it pretty clear here. Now, the way you might imagine these industry dynamics working typically is you'd say something like, well, something changes in this market. Oftentimes that's demand shifts out or demand shifts back. Maybe since we've been talking about entry, maybe we'll talk a little bit about exit, right? So maybe what happens is people, discover that vaping, it turns out, has ill health effects that people didn't think it had before. And so this would cause a change in demand, right? Call this D prime. Demand shifts back. So people want less than they did before. So what does this do here? Well, we'd say, all right, well now we have this new equilibrium price, right? And now what happens is firms, they produce fewer units for the market. So Q star kind of falls like this, right? When demand falls like this, shifts back into the left. So firms are doing the best they can. They're still maximizing profits. The sad part of the story here, though, is that, we go up here to get our average costs. You can see now the market price is below average costs. So your profit margin has become negative, or it's now a loss margin, I guess, right? So what we would do, or what we could say then, is we could say, firms out there are making losses. And if I wanted to think about what that amount of loss was, it would be this box here, right? That's not good, right? And people are saying, you know what? In Eco 200, you can talk about, should I just shut down today or should I keep producing to defray my losses? We'll suppose that, some firms stay in the industry and some don't, right? That is to say there's exit from the industry because of these losses. And we can kind of think about what would happen here over time as firms left the industry, right? As some of these shops closed. Well, by the way, note that nothing is changing about the nothing's changing here about the firm's cost curves. It's all about the big picture, the big supply and demand here. Oh, there we go. So as firms exit the industry, what will happen is this supply will gradually shift back, right? Now you'll notice that I shifted this supply curve back in a very particular way, right? Kind of like this. And I tried to get the intersection to be right here, right? Why did I do that? Well, I was trying to get it at the old price. It's not really getting it at the old price. It's getting it at this zero profit thing, right? Right? So firms leave the industry until the price rises back to this point here. Why is that the case? Well, now nobody has any incentive to either enter or exit the industry, as the case may be. The losses have disappeared. The number of vape shops have dropped to the point where now, right, there are enough to kind of produce at this particular level, to break even, so to speak. Right, and we mean economically breaking even. So we can kind of say, all right, well, we're back at this point here now in the long run. Right, and I can kind of flesh all this out. So the price rises back here. So that's kind of how it would work in reverse when, you know, things go badly. And you can see here that demand shifts around, but ultimately price sort of finds its way back to this minimum average cost point, right, through this process of entry and exit. So one reason why I did this is to kind of accentuate for you that this is a point of gravity here, this long run average cost point. And there are some interesting things about it. And by the way, if you don't, I know there's moving parts here, there's a lot of logic and all that stuff. We're going to revisit this, so if it didn't sink in, you know, the first time, we'll see it a couple of other times. This kind of logic. So those are the long-run dynamics, and maybe I'll just kind of push this back a little bit, and maybe just point it. I'm going to just point at this one more time and just say, well, this is kind of important that we return to this zero profit MC equals AC equal price term here, because what we want to do is it's great that we can describe how an industry works, but we also want to think about what it means for society, right? Is this outcome good for society? It sounds kind of, you look at it and to be honest, you're like, ooh, this is rough on firms. It's like, they make a little money in the short run, but then in the long run, profits are competed away. Sometimes firms lose money and they have to leave the industry. Some of them recover. It sounds a little rough, right? Indeed, market competition can be ruthless, right? But let's think about all this from the perspective of society, right? Now, we've already decided a bunch of things about surpluses, and none of this really changes, right? We still, in our competitive market, have supply and demand crossing, right, at some market equilibrium, say here, and we can still reckon surpluses as we did before, right? We can talk about producer surplus if I'm thinking about my new equilibrium here. Producer surplus is everything below price but above supply. And we still can think of consumer surplus as here. And so everything we said about markets before still holds true, right? In particular, firms produce up until the point where marginal cost is equal to price. People buy up until the point where marginal benefits equal price. So the end result is that every unit that could benefit someone, right, in net is produced, right? Put another way, gains to exchange are exhausted. All that is still true, right? Which we kind of pursued as we talked about price floors and price ceilings. That's still all there. Familiar consumer and producer surplus analysis. But in the long run, we see that something else is true about competitive equilibrium. And I think this might be more important when we talk about the big picture, economic growth and all of those things. This process by which profits are competed away forces firms to be as efficient as they possibly can be, right? And we have a good definition of that, I'll show you. That is to say, because there's this process of entry and exit, firms coming into the industry to dissipate profits, firms leaving the industry when there are none, Well, the ultimate outcome of this is that firms hit this minimum of average cost, right? That's important. Why is that important? Well, this is the most efficient possible way of producing that there is, right? If you were to ask someone, well, what does it mean to be efficient? It means to produce at the lowest possible unit cost, right? That's what's happening here automatically. Competition is forcing firms to do this, right? When we talk a little bit about entrepreneurship in the class, we're going to think about it this way too. What is an innovation? Or what is something new that would rock this industry? Well, if someone came along with a different average cost curve, right? I tinker away in my garage, say, in rural New England, and I come up with a new way of, making maple syrup, but my cost curve is, this marker doesn't work very well, my cost curve is lower than everybody else's, right? I can kind of sell at this high price and make a giant profit, or even sell at a price below everybody else, force them out of business, and be the sole producer there, right? We're going to talk about stuff like that and how it drives progress, and it's going to be a great. I'm already looking forward to it, right? Entrepreneurship and growth and average costs and all that stuff. I got a little excited and I got ahead of myself there, so we'll leave that aside for now. But just notice that this process of entry and exit forces efficiency upon firms, and by efficiency we mean they find this point, the minimum of average cost. They're not producing at $9 per bottle. They're not producing at $8 a bottle. They're forced to well, I guess it is $8 in my example. They are forced to produce at exactly what it costs them to produce. And as consumers, that's of course great for us, right? Okay. So you might tack that on to our laundry list of reasons why competitive markets seem to be good, right? We've talked about this throughout the course of the semester. But you might also be saying to yourself, Baker, it's great, but you've been talking about maple syrup all class. I don't care about maple syrup. I care about iPhones and, I care about, high fashion and things like that, right? Music, who knows, maybe even coffee. And all of those markets have very little to do with what you're talking about, right? This homogeneous product where anybody can go to Home Depot and get set up. I want to talk about advertising and good products and product differentiation and market niches and all those things. So what if we walk away from these assumptions? What happens? Well, the good news is now that we've set all this machinery up, it'll be, I'm hoping to show you, somewhat obvious as to how we modify this to include all of that stuff. And the other thing I'm going to add to that is whenever we introduce any one of those things, like you have a positioned product or you have something unique that you're producing, all of these things do basically one thing from the economic perspective that interests us, and that is all of these things give you some degree of what we call market power, right? Ooh, market power, that sounds great. Now, even better, we have a concrete definition of what market power is, right? How exactly market power figures into this problem. And you can think about it really simply in your mind as instead of this situation over here, where you see that flat line where the price is, one way of thinking about what that means is firms take prices as given, right? Whatever I produce, the price is the same. When you have market power, not so. You understand that when you produce more, you change the price, right? How you understand that doesn't matter, right? Are you dropping the price to sell more? Is it because you produce more units and you need to lower the price? It turns out it doesn't really matter because you have to think about, if you're thinking about the firm's problem when there's market power, you're now choosing a price-quantity combination, not just a quantity. That's the important thing, and we're going to discuss what I mean by that as we move along. Is the attendance sheet still moving around? All right, yeah, we'll get it. Who all has had the attendance sheet so far? Okay, so it just needs to, I guess I can come run and grab it and move it up front here. We'll make sure everybody gets it in good time. We still have some time here. Okay, so the key thing here is when you have market power, your product becomes unique. And there's a couple things that we bundle in with this. So for example, you might say, your product is unique. Well, that means that you're producing something no one else can. Another way of saying that is that no one can enter your industry exactly or perfectly, right? So, when I sell my coffee at my coffee shop, part of that is the way I make coffee, but maybe part of my unique product is me, right? I'm a little bit different than everybody else out there, and you say hello to me, and I say, that sort of thing. My example will be economics lessons, right, that I'm going to use in a second to show you how this works. And, that you might sort of think about, why can't anybody sell economics lessons? Well, I could say, well, nobody will give them exactly like me. Somebody might try, but maybe they don't have my education, personality, so I'm unique. There is a barrier to entering my industry, you might say, is a technical way of putting it. And that's also a nice way of saying it because we can think about other things that keep people from producing what you do. There's all sorts of things that do that. And of course, there are all these other things that you might think about. How did Baker get to be unique? How did he develop his product? What quality is it? Those are all important things, and we'll get to those. But we're just going to start, once again, with this one little change. I have market power. Do you want me to, has everybody gotten that sheet so far? Here, I'll take it and I'll move it down to... So this was the play. I guess we can. Yeah, I'll start it over here, and maybe we'll go across and all that. Okay. So let's imagine that I have kids who are getting to that college age and all that stuff. So that's an expense. So I'm trying to make some extra money, and maybe I do this on Saturday. So I have 3 free hours in the morning, and I say, you know what? I'll give some economics lessons, 1-hour lessons, and first thing I want to do is think about my costs. And, we had a question about this earlier in class. Let's just forget about that part of the, we have marginal costs going up usually. Let's forget about that for now, just to keep things simple. And we'll suppose that my marginal costs are $50 always, right? So what does this mean? The personal cost to me of giving that first lesson, what is the it takes a little bit of energy and time and effort to do this, so it's about $50 worth of effort from me. That's what it costs to give me my first lesson. Once I'm done with my first lesson, to do another will also cost me $50. Normally we would expect that to go up, right? Because maybe I'm getting tired. And then, given I've done a second, we'll say the third costs $50 as well. So constant marginal costs here. Not our typical assumption, even simpler. So if I were to give 3 lessons, you would say my total costs are $150. And we'll suppose that, even simpler, that I don't really have any, all I need is myself. I don't need to buy any materials or anything, so my average costs are just the same as my marginal costs. $50 per unit, $50 every time I teach a lesson, so if I do 3 lessons, the totals are $150. Hopefully you're with me there. Okay, very economic, by the way, what I did here. I'm saying we're not worried about the costs right now. We're just thinking about this pricing part of the problem. And I'm going to do that in as simple a fashion as I possibly can. And we're going to say there is this demand structure, right? And I know that if I do the thing where I put the, I put the little poster in my building. I have the little pull tabs with my phone number on there. And I know that if I slap that up there and I set a price of $100, one person will come knocking. Maybe it's the retired person who's made a lot of money and just wants to, they don't care if it's expensive, they'll pay for an economics lesson. So I know one person will buy a lesson if I set the price at $100. If I set the price on my little sheet at $80 a lesson, inquire within, right? I know that I'll get a second person, maybe the college student who's failing economics or something like that, right? And then, maybe when I lower the price even further, a third person will pull that tab and give me a call. Maybe that's a high school student who's doing okay, but, wants to know more, something like that, right? So basically what I'm doing is I'm sort of observing my demand curve, right? I'm saying at P equal 100, one unit. At P equal 80, 2 units. At P equal 60, 3 units, right? Okay. So far, so good? Now, we can ask a question that, one way you always want to start these things is you sort of want to start by saying, well, okay, that's great that now I know this and all that stuff, but what if I didn't, right? Put another way, what if I was just behaving as if I was in a competitive industry, right? Maybe all economics are really the same, and in this case, I know there's a going rate for these lessons and it's $60, right? Anybody can supply a lesson at $60, fine. Then all I have to do is I say, well, the price is $60. All I have to do is compare my costs to my marginal cost to price, as we've been doing. And since my marginal costs are 50, right? Well, let's see. I can get 60 for my first lesson. It cost me 50. I can get 60 for my second lesson. Cost me 50. 60 for my third lesson. It cost me 50. I know that if I do all three, I'll make, in essence, a profit. Has everybody gotten the sheet? No? Who is the? Okay. Here, I'll move it over there. Thank you, sir. Okay. So that's what I would do if I faced a fixed price. But what if I don't? Well, let's see here. If I supply one lesson, I know that the price will be 100, right? I'll get that, the rich retired person. In which case, I figure out my profits from supplying one lesson and setting the price at 100. By the way, note, I'm picking Q equal 1 and P equal 100 as a combination there, right? I can pick my Q and my P at the same time in this scenario. So I get 100 and I subtract my costs, my profits are then 50. If I do 2 lessons, I say to myself, all right, well, let's see, if I want to do 2 lessons, the price is going to have to fall to 80 to attract that second person, but then I'll get 80 times 2 is 160. 160 minus 100, 50 plus 50, my costs. Well, that now gives me $60 in profits, right? What about 3 lessons? Well, 3 lessons is great, but I know that if I want to sell a third lesson, I have to move further down my demand curve and set the price at 60. 3 times 6 is 180, minus my costs of 50 plus 50 plus 50 is 150, gives me 30. So what is the best option now? Oh, great, thank you. And if for whatever reason you missed the attendance sheet, you can sign it after class. So what is my best option now? It looks like option 2, right? Maximum profits is at 2. That would be me supplying 2 lessons at a price of $80. Notice that this is different from what I would do if the price was just 60, right? I would have supplied all 3. So in this scenario, you might think about it, and we're going to make this concrete. What happens is I say, well, let's see here. When I'm in charge of the quantity and the price, I sort of know that every time I want to produce more, I have to lower price. Producing more is good, right? I can sell more. But it's bad in that I lower the price. So I have to kind of balance those things. Selling more at lower prices and getting higher quantities. So that's kind of the fundamental lesson here, is I want to produce a little bit less when I have market power, right? We're going to see how that works. So the way you might do this, or the way we might make this concrete with all of everything that we've talked about, is we might think about what we call marginal revenue here, right? And what is marginal revenue? It describes how my revenue changes as I increase units. And here it's not just the price, as it was in the competitive case, right? When I was selling maple syrup, every time I produced another unit, I just got the market price back. Here, that's not the case, right? When I expand my production of economics lessons, I have to lower the price. So, for example, my first lesson, right, generates $100 in revenue for me, right? When I produce my second lesson, right, well, it turns out I sell the first lesson at 100 and the second lesson at 80, but we want to ask how much additional revenue do I get from that second lesson? Well, when I did one, my total revenue was 100, right? When I do two, my total revenue is 80 times 2 is 160. So you could say revenue goes from 100 to 160 when I produce a second unit. $60 is my additional revenue there, right? It's not 80, the price of that last unit. It's 60. Well, why is that the case? I lose $20 from my first unit, right? I have to lower the price of that one too when I increase production. Lesson 3, my marginal revenue falls even further, right? So let's see. When I produced 2 lessons was 160. The third lesson is 60 times 3 is 180. 180 minus 160 is 20. So 20 would be my marginal revenue. So at the end of the day, you see why I don't produce that lesson. The 20 additional dollars don't outweigh the $50 of additional costs. It's one way to think about it. Of course, we're getting close to the end of the lecture time here. I know retention goes down there, but I'll say that what we're going to do going forward is make this a little bit more operational on our diagram, but this is the fundamental logic. Whenever marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, I should produce if I have market power. And I want to get marginal revenue as close to marginal cost as possible. This is like P equal MC in competition, right? But here, P is changing, right? So that's what we're kind of doing here. And we're going to do this in general next time. Now, one last thing that we'll throw this out there as we're sort of parting ways here until next week. You might say, you know what you should have done, Baker? You shouldn't have, when you put your little flyer there in the lobby of your building on the bulletin board, why did you even put a price? You should have just said, inquire within, right? And then what I could have done is I could have charged the elderly retired person $100, and I could have charged a different price to the struggling college student of $80, right? Put another way, I could have charged each person their willingness to pay. And that would change things too. That's called price discrimination, and we're going to discuss that as well. A lot of fun, right? So, yeah, get your work done by tomorrow. I'm looking forward to seeing what you all had to say, and have a great weekend.